Good evening. My name is Bruce Pursley, and on behalf of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute, United States Senate, welcome to tonight's Stone Social Impact Forum featuring Nicholas Kristof. As chairman of the board of the Kennedy Institute, I am honored to open this annual forum that is produced in partnership with our good friends at the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation and made possible by the James M. and Kathleen D. Stone Foundation. The Stone Social Impact Forum honors bold civic change agents who tackle inequality and inspire all people to be civically active. I'm now pleased to introduce this year's featured speaker, Nicholas Kristof. Mr. Kristof is a Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times columnist and a journalist known for his reporting on human rights and giving a voice to the voiceless around the world. During his reporting and travels, Mr. Kristof has experienced wars, confronted warlords, survived a plane crash, and even caught malaria. In 1990, Kristof and his wife, Cheryl Wu Dunn, became the first husband-wife team to win a Pulitzer Prize for journalism for their coverage of China's Tiananmen Square democracy movement. He won his second Pulitzer in 2006 for his reporting on the genocide in Darfur. Kristof and Wu Dunn have written 5 best-selling books, and their most recent publication and focus of tonight's conversation is Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope. Mr. Kristof is also a candidate for governor in the state of Oregon. After covering crises around the world, he was moved to run after seeing the inequality and issues facing his own state. Joining Mr. Kristof to moderate the conversation is his wife, the first Asian American woman reporter to win a Pulitzer Prize. In addition to her many journalistic accomplishments, Mrs. Wu Dunn is also a successful business executive, a co-founder of Full Sky Partners, a consulting firm focusing on double bottom line ventures in new media, technology, and healthcare services. I'm pleased to turn this over to Mrs. Wu Dunn to get us started. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited to be here, especially to interview my husband. Nick will speak in a little bit, and I encourage you all to send questions to the chat room so that we can actually ask a lot of questions of Nick. And don't be shy about putting in some tough questions. And after he speaks for about 12 to 15 minutes, I will then come back and start the interview. You can also, as Bruce mentioned, you can also ask him about the governor's race. So without any further ado, I will turn it now over to Nick Kristof.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. And did you have to invite everybody to ask really tough questions of me? I'm, this is kind of date night for us. We're really delighted to be able to be together on this. We're on the family farm, but in separate rooms here. And so it's great to have a family event. You know, I can't write columns by myself. I can't write books by myself. These days, I can't run for governor by myself. And so I'm really delighted to do this with Cheryl. I should also say that we're great admirers of the Stone Social Impact Forum. And so thanks to them for hosting us. And I also came of age when Senator Edward Kennedy was, in the Senate, a incredibly dynamic advocate for all the issues that I'm fighting for today. And if we had listened to him more when he was in the Senate, then I think some of these issues would be less of a challenge for the United States today. So let me explain what it is that I'm doing, how it is that a New York Times columnist ended up writing so much about the struggles of working class America, how we ended up writing Tightrope, and why indeed I ended up leaving a wonderful job to run for office. And it really starts with this hometown where I'm speaking from. The family farm here is 4 miles from a little tiny town of Yamhill, Oregon, population 1,000 on a good day. And so when I was growing up here, I took the bus every day, the number 6 bus to Yamhill Grade School, Yamhill Carleton High School. At that point, it was the biggest local employer was a glove factory. There were also jobs in agriculture and timber. There was a cannery nearby. And everybody pretty much looked forward to living better lives, just as their parents had lived better lives and their grandparents. And so, for example, the kids who got on the bus right after me each morning on the number 6 bus were the 5 Knapp kids. Actually, can we show the first slide? I'll show them at Christmas when I was a kid growing up. The Knapp kids, that's their mom in the background. She had a job driving tractor on a local farm. I guess their dad took the picture. He had a good union job laying pipe, mostly sewer pipe. And the child in the middle, Farland, was my year. He was the oldest, and he was my classmate. And then you had his brother Zealand, his brother Nathan, their sister Regina, and their baby brother Keelan. And can we have the next slide? This is the 9th grade yearbook. That's Farland on top. And you may guess who that incorrigible kid right below him is. That's me in 9th grade. And because Knapp and Kristoff both began with K, we were parked right next to each other in the yearbook. But then those good union jobs, like the ones that Farland's parents had had, like so many other people had had, they went away. And the glove factory that I mentioned as the biggest employer, that moved to Costa Rica. Meth arrived at about that same time. And this community, which we had always patted ourselves on the back about for our strong rural values and our rigorous social fabric, it truly in some ways became unraveled. Farland lost his job. He self-medicated with meth. He died of liver failure from drug and alcohol abuse. His brother Zealand died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. Nathan blew himself up cooking meth. Regina died of hepatitis from IV drug use. And the baby of the family, Keelan, he had survived mostly because he was in prison for 13 years, Oregon State Penitentiary, for drug-related offenses. But he was released, and then at the beginning of the pandemic, he overdosed. And so they're all gone now, one after the other. This next slide is a picture of their mom visiting the kids every day. She walks up the hill and visits the graves of her 5 kids. And she's still alive in her 80s. And, you know, this happens far too much across the country. On my number 6 school bus, more than a quarter of the kids are gone from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. That has happened on number 6 buses like that all over Oregon, all over the country, particularly for working class Americans of every complexion. Even before the pandemic, life expectancy fell for 3 years in a row, the first time in 100 years since the 1918 influenza that had happened. And it has also, of course, led to political cataclysms. You know, the reasons for Trump's rise and for extremism and polarization around the country are complicated, but I think in part they have to do with the struggles of working class Americans and the fact that many working class voters feel that they've been left behind by both parties. And that's not entirely incorrect. In early this year, the average blue-collar weekly wages, adjusting for inflation, were actually lower than they had been in December 1972. Essentially 2 generations with no increase in after inflation wages. There's an awful lot of bitterness that flows from that. And then from my point of view, when President Trump came along and told people that he was going to bring factories back and that he offered a target and was blaming immigrants, then people felt that he was talking to them, and they were willing to buy that because too often they were desperate. So I think if we're going to help heal the country, we also have to address the fissures, economic fissures that leave so many behind economically and socially, that leave so many open wounds. Now, I wondered a lot about, how this came to pass, what happened. And Yam Hill is in many ways lily white, but and then in the 1990s, it was, I think, common for people in Yam Hill to look at struggles in African-American communities and say, oh, the problem is what people call Black culture, or as deadbeat dads, or as irresponsible behavior, or as bad choices. And meanwhile, there was a great Harvard sociologist, William Julius Wilson, who said, no, it's not a culture, it's jobs, it's a loss of good jobs. And Professor Wilson was exactly right, because when good jobs left lily white Yam Hill or Kentucky or Northern Maine, the same kinds of problems unfolded. And so I think we have to look in this country at what happened with the loss of good jobs and the consequences for people around the country when that happened. I want to show you the next slide. This is the kid who grew up right next to me, Mike Stepp. And Mike was actually 5 years younger than me. His dad had a good union job at the local mill. He was a Democrat because of that union job. And then, of course, that went away, and Mike floundered. He became homeless. And during the pandemic, almost exactly a year ago, he died on the streets of McMinnville, Oregon. And Mike was a complicated guy. He suffered enormously, but he also inflicted great suffering on others. And he was behind $78,000 in child support when he died. His wife and his 2 kids struggled greatly. And I keep thinking that we as a society spent a lot of time incarcerating Mike, struggling to support his kids. And that money would have been so much better off spent if it had been spent making sure that Mike got a good education, giving him job training, helping him fight his addictions. None of these are perfect, but they're sure better than investing in prisons and incarceration and the consequences when we fail to support people. I think it becomes too easy in the US to say that the kind of problems that I'm describing are, that this is simply about automation or technology. Automation and technology, those are real issues for working class Americans, but they're also real issues for working class Germans and Canadians, and other countries don't have the kind of despair that we have. America is now losing people at the rate of 100,000 a year from overdoses. No other country is losing people at that rate. And I think we have to look into our policies and the choices that we make as a country. And that, I think, is one of the lessons of this despair we're seeking. That's one of the reasons I'm making my career move. And, in particular, if you look back at where we were in about 1980 and the choices we've made since then I think there are policy choices that led to the decline of private sector unions. There are choices that led to stagnation of educational standards. We were #1 in the world in high school graduation rates and college graduation rates. We pretty much invented mass high school attendance. And then since then, so many other countries have surpassed us in educational standards. In the 1970s, we were in the middle of the pack in terms of life expectancy and child mortality. Now I believe we rank number 41 in child mortality around the world. So many other countries are ahead of us in health metrics as well as education metrics. And if you want to look at where a country is going to be in 25 or 40 years, I think those in education metrics, that human capital is the best indication of where we're headed. And it doesn't look good. And it's not that those at the top are struggling. It's just that a country itself can't thrive and prosper when so many citizens within it are struggling. This also, of course, leads to enormous political divides in our country when so many are left behind. And, we found that we can't address public health when so many people, partly because of lack of education, think that if they get vaccinated, that somehow Bill Gates will be putting a chip in their brain. And I see this in some of my old friends here in this very conservative area in rural Oregon. And it breaks my heart when people I care about refuse vaccinations and are suspicious of them, and thus in turn inflict risks on all those around them, on the larger community. But I think we can address these problems. And so fundamentally, that's why I decided to take this career move. These are hard problems, whether it's homelessness or education, but other countries have managed to address them. They've understood the importance of investing in human capital. There are jurisdictions around the country that have seen real progress in homelessness, for example. Kern County, California, managed to reduce chronic homelessness to 0. We've seen other models that have shown real progress, but they haven't been adequately scaled and they haven't been adequately replicated. And I think that's in part because it's been too easy for us to be oblivious to the struggles of those at the bottom. And I've seen the difference that can unfold when we do see that investment in young people in particular. When I was growing up in rural Oregon, and here there was a friend of mine was growing up in Southern Oregon, and her name is Anne. She went to high school in Ashland, Oregon. She was from a working class family, one of 5 kids, and had no plans to go to college. She wasn't going to be able to afford it. And then a teacher, Hattie Converse, stopped her in the hallway in the spring of senior year and said, "So Anne, where are you going to go to college?" And Anne said, "Look, I can't afford college. My family can't afford it." And Mrs. Converse pretty much led her to the office and very forcefully said, "Anne, you've got to go to college." And gave her an application to the University of Oregon. And Anne applied. She got a scholarship. And that was also a time, of course, when one was able to work one's way through college. And Anne was able to do that. So after graduating in journalism, Anne got a job at a local TV station, then a job at another TV station in Portland, and on. And so Ann Curry, whom you know, became one of the great journalists of our time and was on the Today Show and is still doing incredibly important health reporting around the country. And I think about, my own family, and I talked about the Knapps. And I've often wondered why it was that I'm here before you and Farland Knapp, my classmate, or the 4 other Knapps, why they're no longer with us, and what would have happened if I'd grown up in the Knapp household or Farland had grown up in mine. And I think that the difference was that, there were no books in the Knapp household. My house was nothing but books. I was being hugged every day by my parents and told I would go to college. And Farland Knapp's dad was violent toward the children and toward Mrs. Knapp, periodically fired guns at his wife in ways that traumatized the kids. Farland grew up wanting to kill his dad. That does something pretty serious to a child's developing brain. And as I think how that opportunity came to me, I think it's in part capital that was transmitted from my dad. My dad was a refugee from Eastern Europe who arrived in the US in 1952, not speaking English, but he was able then to get a job at a logging camp in rural Oregon in the mountains. And that was a time when you could get a job as a logger, and it was a union job as a logger. And he was able to earn enough money that with a lot of hard work and other jobs, he was able to work his way through Reed College and then go on to grad school, where he met my mom, and later became a professor. And so I was bequeathed with all this human capital. Essentially, the opportunities that he got were transmitted to the next generation, to me, and I became the beneficiary as well. That's what we need more of. And I think we're only going to get that if we understand how many people across this country have been left behind. And to the extent it's our policies that have left them behind, the extent to which we can offer them not a pointed finger, but a helping hand. So thank you very much. And now I'll subject myself to a grilling from Cheryl.
Thank you very much for that. And I want to remind the audience to please start submitting your questions. You've heard Nick deliver a very, very moving speech about his friends in Yamhill. So please send your questions. So Nick, I'd like to ask you a first question. You've talked about a lot of problems, and a lot of these are not just focused in Yamhill. They happen all across the country. Homelessness, addiction, problems with education. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the solutions. Please talk about addiction. That was the one that really plagued a lot of your friends. And of course, you mentioned 100,000 people dying from overdoses. So clearly it's affecting the rest of the country. There's a program in Tightrope that talks about peer counseling in McMinnville. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a program called Provoking Hope, and I think it's typical of many of the successful programs that have been used to address addiction. It was founded by somebody who herself had struggled for many, many years, and I think that's often the way it works. It's a charismatic person who knows that world very well, and in a way that gives that person credibility in talking to people who are presently struggling with addiction. And I've had friends who have been rescued by that program, by Provoking Hope. It is funded in part by the county because it saves money when the county invests in this kind of intensive counseling and support. But, look, it's not perfect. Addiction is hard. People relapse. But we understand that we have to keep fighting cancer, even though cancer periodically recurs. And in the same way, we have to keep fighting addiction and support those because essentially there's no alternative. We can't give up. And to me, one of the great tragedies of this country is that we've overwhelmingly tried to fight addiction with the criminal justice toolbox and not with the public health toolbox.
Well, actually, can you get a little bit more into Provoking Hope? Because as a program, how did it work? I think that, a lot of, towns and cities and counties around the country want to figure out how do they start their own programs that work.
So it has a strong element of group sessions with people who are struggling, and then a peer counselor who has been through these issues themselves and talking and trying to emphasize, trying to understand their own responsibility, trying to build motivation, trying to understand how they can get better lives for themselves and the people they care most about if they avoid whatever it may be, drugs, alcohol, whatever it may be. And in some cases, Provoking Hope itself doesn't provide medication-assisted treatment, but it is linked to other programs that do supply that, like Suboxone for people addicted with heroin. And that has to be a pivotal part of the program. Whether there's medication or whether it's focused on counseling, I mean, both kinds of interventions work, albeit work imperfectly, but only 20% of Americans actually who have addictions actually get access to that kind of treatment, even though it pays for itself so many times over. And that seems to me just a huge blind spot for us as a country.
You mentioned that Keelan had been sort of spared because he was in jail for about 13 years, and that sort of, kept him safe. It isn't a great business model for prisons to be housing people like that. Maybe it does cure them of their addiction, but can you talk about some of the more successful programs that try and focus on both the prison reform side, but also treatment of addiction side?
Yeah, and boy, I would just underscore that point you made that prison is not the ideal way to treat people struggling with addiction. Now, we wouldn't lock people up in prisons because they're wrestling with diabetes, for example, and we shouldn't lock people up when they're struggling with addictions. And there's also a cost issue. Prison, depending on the state, costs about $45,000 per person per year. Often the child of that person who was incarcerated is going to have worse outcomes as a result. And so, the cost, instead of, keeping somebody in school, is about $11,000 a year. Providing job training is much cheaper. Addiction treatment is much cheaper. So one of the programs that I really came to admire is in a state you might not expect to have sort of pioneering public health interventions, and that is in Oklahoma. It's in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We have a chapter about it in Tightrope. And it was essentially a way of helping moms in particular who are wrestling with addiction, who would otherwise be going to prison for drug-related offenses. And it's a diversion program. So a woman who is facing a 5 or 10 year sentence applies. And if she can make the case that she's a good bet, then she's admitted into this program called Women in Recovery. And part of it is indeed this very intensive therapy. It also involves a job placement program when people are ready for it. And so the community provides, the local companies offer jobs in a bakery, in a warehouse, to give people a sense they can have better outcomes, to give people some income, a sense that if they do things right, their future can be different. One of the problems with addiction treatment normally is that often it lasts only about a month. And if somebody's been wrestling with addiction for 10 or 20 years, it's frankly unrealistic to expect them to get over it in a month. Women in Recovery lasts 12 to 18 months. It has more than a 90% success rate over 3 years. In other words, after 3 years, fewer than 10% have had to be incarcerated. The rest are members of society, and it saved the state of Oklahoma $84 million because this is a program that is an awful lot cheaper than locking people up in prison. It's been a huge success, and it just pains me that there isn't women in recovery all over the country, and that there isn't men in recovery like that all over the country as well. We just don't do a good job reaching people who desperately need it around the nation.
So I gather in Oregon, you'll try and bring women in recovery and men in recovery to Oregon, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Another question that you raised is homelessness. That is a problem that plagues all of our major cities. Oregon obviously has a huge number per capita. What are some of the solutions that you've seen that work in homelessness? A lot have been tried. Some have worked more successfully than others. Please talk about some of the successes.
Yeah, and I guess one point I would make is that it's not just about good intentions. And in general, good policymaking is not just about kind of wanting to do the right thing. Good intentions are not enough. And so if you take homelessness, for example, both Houston and Dallas are democratically run cities, run by Democrats. And they both tried to address homelessness in serious ways. And yet in Dallas, homelessness went up, and in Houston, it declined by about half. And similar lessons have been applied in other cities. And, the places that have done it well, including Houston, one of the keys is simply to make sure that you know a great deal about every person who is unsheltered on the streets. And so they become a name and not just a kind of an anonymous person out there. And once you have that information, then you can begin to address the problem. You can find out, okay, Susie here is a veteran. Maybe she can get veterans benefits, and that can provide an income stream so that she can pay $600 a month for a rental space. Or Billy over here, okay, he's got an aunt in Topeka, and let's get that aunt on the phone, and maybe she can talk to Billy, and maybe she can offer a bedroom, or maybe she can at least encourage him to get into treatment. Let's see what we can do, and try to bring in family members. As often the problem is people are isolated. If you look at homelessness, there are several drivers of it, several ways to address it. We need to do a better job of addressing alcoholism and addiction, because by most estimates, the majority of people unsheltered are dealing with substance use problems. But that's not enough. We also need to provide some kind of emergency shelters. That can be shelters as such, or it can be tiny home villages, but there need to be alternatives that one can provide immediately to help people off the street. But I think another aspect of it, another element of a solution, which we don't think about often enough, is the supply of housing, which is related to affordability. There is more addiction in West Virginia or Kentucky than there is in California or Oregon, yet West Virginia and Kentucky have lower homelessness rates. And that's because even if you were wrestling with problems in West Virginia, you can still find a room to rent for $600 a month in a way you can't in San Francisco or in Portland. And here in Oregon, for example, we're short 135,000 housing units. That drives up the cost of housing, and that in turn leads to a significant increase in people who are couch surfing, who are sleeping in their cars, or in some cases are out on the streets. So we have to do more to incentivize the construction of housing units and speed up the pipelines to get that done. None of this is easy. This is all complicated and difficult, but boy, we can do a better job of it.
So in Oregon, they passed a inclusionary zoning law, which is well intended, but why hasn't it helped the homelessness or the housing shortage?
So the bill was meant to require that apartment buildings with more than 20 units include a share of affordable units. And this is an approach that has been done in other cities and has been successful in other places. But in Oregon, housing economists say that the share of units that had to be affordable was too high. The incentives were insufficient. And so it became unprofitable to build large apartment buildings. And so as a result, they say that the construction of apartment buildings of more than 20 units simply collapsed. And that the upshot has been fewer apartment buildings being built and less supply of affordable housing. That's the argument that the housing economists make.
So one can pass bills, but you really have to see what works on the ground. Is that right?
I think that's true more broadly around the country, that I believe the prescription for good policy is, on the one hand, being deeply familiar with the literature and with the best evidence and with the randomized control trials that show what works in different cities. But that one also has to recognize that nothing ever works quite as planned. One needs to be relentlessly empirical. And that means spending time in the grassroots, talking to people who are struggling, understanding their complicated decision-making, and being willing to self-correct policies when one screws up, as is inevitable. So for those people watching, especially students who may be thinking about a career in public policy, I think it's really important to be familiar with the literature, but also to spend time in the grassroots to see how it's always more complicated than it seems in the journal articles.
So I want to ask you one question about education, and then I'll go to the audience questions. Can you talk about what one can do in places like Oregon, where the education system has been on the, has been weakening instead of strengthening? What do public school systems do?
So I think one of the lessons generally in terms of providing opportunity and addressing poverty is that we often start too late, and that maybe the most important window is when kids are malleable in the first 1,000 days of life. And we, as a country, we largely begin investing in kids when they enter the public school system at 5 or so. And some states have, or in more states all the time, are developing pre-K, but that may be at age 4. And I think that the evidence is overwhelming that maybe the highest return investment we have as a country is in struggling kids in pre-K and even younger. One of the gold standard interventions is called a nurse-family partnership, which helps kids. It begins in utero and up to age 2, and yet, and it's things like encouraging moms when pregnant to try to avoid alcohol and drugs, then to try to reduce lead exposures in the house, to try to make sure that a boyfriend or a dad isn't shaking the baby if he gets mad at the baby. It's often very simple interventions, but it has a huge impact. It's reading to the child, talking to the child, and even though it ends at age 2, it means that children have higher graduation rates 16 years later. It means they have less contact with the criminal justice system as teenagers. If their girls are less likely to become pregnant in high school. And so I would really like to see, some of these early childhood interventions get more traction. And it's been really exciting to me to see, President Biden and the Build Back Better law emphasize some of these early childhood programs, including childhood allowances, which in the U.S. would be in the form of a refundable tax credit for children. The evidence is that they would reduce child poverty by about half. And I think of child poverty in the US as a huge moral stain on this country. The idea that we are so close to getting a policy that could reduce that by half is thrilling, but also kind of terrifying that we may not take that path.
Yes, well, let's hope that we do. So one of the audience questions is, how can we make better policy choices when our country is so polarized? People no longer believe in civility. Lying has become the norm, and our democracy is on the brink of destruction. This is the question. We have never faced our gun problems, our drug problems, our corruption issues with the wealthy and illicit financial flows. How do you turn all of this around? And if you're elected governor, what will be your top priorities?
So it's hard. It's going to be really hard. I would say that I think we maybe have more of an opportunity than we might have had historically, because at least my perception is that one of the reasons we didn't do more to invest in human capital and to support kids who were struggling is frankly because of racism and the idea really beginning with Nixon's Southern strategy, that if we invested in total services, if we invested in human capital, then we were disproportionately investing in kids of color. I think that was one reason why the US, in contrast to Canada and to Western Europe, did not expand medical coverage, did not provide early childhood interventions, did not provide national pre-K, national childcare, et cetera. In 1971, we came very, very close to providing a national high-quality childcare system. And at the last minute, President Nixon reversed himself, and we don't have it. And so I think that racism was at the root of many of our wrong choices as a country. But the politics of that, in some areas, may be changing a little bit as more of the white working class has been struggling. And you see that in addiction. Historically, we talked about junkies who needed to be locked up and throw away the key. And now, as more whites have been struggling with addiction, we've adopted a more compassionate policy, and we talk about treatment and people in need of treatment and so on. And this is utterly hypocritical, and it's a complete double standard. But if it does lead to a more compassionate, more enlightened approach, then it's belated, but it's better than certainly not having it. Likewise, if you look at polling on issues like like early childhood, like national pre-K, like childcare, higher minimum wage, then they all poll pretty well. And I think, my belief here in Oregon is that we have to do a much better job going after working class voters. And we're not going to get as many as we would like, but we have a fighting chance to get some of them. I'm of the belief that it's important to go out and reach out to red counties and go out and show the respect of listening to people, making one's argument, and also offering an economic vision. A lot of these rural counties have been left behind economically. They don't really have a business model. I think it's important for a governor to be seen as representing those parts of the state and offering a new vision. And what I've been talking to people about here in Oregon is some clean energy models or climate tech models. So, okay, in the poorest county of Oregon, for example, Lake County, there's not going to be future for logging and a major future for logging, perhaps, but there is tremendous geothermal potential. There is great solar and wind potential, and those are good paying jobs. Somebody installing a wind turbine, they can get $80,000 or $90,000 a year. And people here in my rural area, a lot of them don't believe in climate change. They do believe in good jobs. And so I think that we have to fight for those votes. One of the things that I admired about the Kennedy clan was their emphasis on trying to knit together the Black and white working class and emphasizing the commonality of interest. I think we have to absolutely do that today and not abandon, not give up on those voters, but fight for them.
So you mentioned good jobs. There's a question here about how can we bring union jobs back? What will it take when unions have been on such sharp decline for so long now, especially in the private sector?
I think there are a couple of things we can do. I mean, I think part of it is policies. And, we have to acknowledge that for decades, we have pursued policies that have made it a lot harder for unions. And that's, particularly true maybe on the enforcement side. I just find it outrageous that we've essentially incentivized companies to break unions. And if a company, for example, fires a labor organizer, then at worst, they're likely, 2 years later to get a slap on the wrist and a fine of, $30,000 or something, when that company may have saved itself hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars by firing that employee. We've essentially incentivized that company to behave badly and made that company, put that company at an advantage compared to other companies because it's breaking the law. And the solution has to be much greater penalties and naming and shaming those companies and holding the CEOs and the board members' feet to the fire when they do these things. None of this is perfect, but I think we can arrest the decline in private sector unions that, as the question notes, has been a major national problem, and by most accounts is responsible for perhaps 20% of the increase in inequality in the US.
Another question. You are making so much sense. We have one party who refuses to pass the latest bill to support human infrastructure. You may be in one of the few states where you can get the legislature to go along with you, as evidenced by this zoning law that we talked about earlier. That isn't very effective. I'm sure that even liberal Massachusetts can do this work. I know you care about the US, not just Oregon. How do you get other governors to buy into this?
So look, I'm a baby politician. I'm just learning as I go, but I know a little bit about communication and about the importance of communication. And I would argue that we need to do a better job, not just passing legislation, but also in making our pitch to the country. And that means reaching, we can't get things done as Democrats unless we actually win enough states that we can control the Senate and the House. And I think that too often we're willing to just give up on a lot of working class voters. I think that would be a huge mistake. And so part of it, I think, is making the case. I think it also has to be an argument about first causes, if you will. I think I think since 1980, I talked about some of the policy mistakes that we as a country made. I think that we also made a narrative mistake. I think that since 1980, we as a country adopted a narrative in which when people struggle economically, it's their personal failing. It's about personal responsibility. It's about bad choices. It's about failing to lift people up by their bootstraps. And one of the problems has been that many working class Americans, including my neighbors, they came to absorb that narrative and believe it. And when they struggled, they blamed themselves for not lifting themselves up by the bootstraps. And you know, that phrase used to mean the opposite of what it does now. When the phrase picking yourself up by your bootstraps, lifting yourself up by your bootstraps came into existence in the early 19th century, it meant to do something impossible. It was a kind of a snide, comical reference to do something impossible, because of course you can't lift yourself up by your boots. And yet somehow today that is our instruction to people. And, you know, I think about the Knapps who grew up next to me, or about Mike Stepp. There is no doubt that they made bad choices. Farland shouldn't have abused drugs and alcohol. Mike shouldn't have done that. But they were on a trajectory to make mistakes from the time they were very, very young. And I think society in some ways failed them before they failed society. And so if we're going to have the conversation about personal responsibility, then I think it's also important for us as a country to have a conversation about our collective responsibility. And that means, above all, providing opportunity to kids. And I do think that that word opportunity is a good word to unite people. Often liberals like myself, we use the word, we talk about inequality. I think conservatives often bristle at that and think, oh, you're talking about making everybody exactly equal. Opportunity is one of those words that pretty much unites everybody. I saw one poll that 97% of Americans agree there should be broader opportunity at the beginning of life. You know, 97% of Americans don't agree that the world is round. So if we get 97% of Americans agreeing on supporting more opportunity early in life, let's leverage that and do what we can as a country to support kids in ways that will benefit those kids, but will also benefit us as a country.
Great. Another question from the audience. In what ways can we work towards revitalizing communities that have been impacted by globalization while still dismantling the historic and ongoing hurdles that face communities of color so that the rising tide lifts all boats?
So, you know, I thought about that a lot in the context of Oregon, of course, and about, you know, my own community. I think of my classmates who died as in many ways dying for a lack of a solid education and a lack of good jobs. And I think we have to address both. And, you know, education is going to mean everything from early childhood on, then making sure that every kid graduates from high school and is literate. And then ideally after that is, you know, either on a path to four-year college or on a path to some kind of a vocational skill. There are lots of vocational opportunities, and we often fail the 2/3 of Americans who aren't going to end up with a college degree. If we could support them as they become electricians or plumbers or wind turbine installers, then that is good for them, and it's good for the state. A lot of my friends would be alive now if they had been able to get a good job as an electrician working in a mill or wherever else. We also, I think, have to acknowledge that, you know, good jobs really matter. And that's why I'm trying to get some of these good jobs here in Oregon, whether it's, you know, wind or offshore waves or geothermal or chip factories. We in Oregon, Intel is the biggest corporate employer. I would love to see Intel come and put another factory here, because that creates a lot of good jobs, paying an average of $150,000 each. And those aren't all engineers. One of our neighbors here is a carpenter who builds clean rooms for Intel. So I think we have to focus on those that education and that human capital and those good jobs, and just try above all to break those cycles of poverty that propel disadvantage from one generation to the next. And we can do it. It's hard, but we can do it.
So we have several questions about the campaign, which I will try and roll into one, and then see if we have a question, time for another. So what is the biggest challenge your campaign has faced so far? And there are several questions about your experience, your management experience, and please talk about that.
I think it always surprises people when a journalist is making this leap. I had, of course, been an editor before I became a columnist. I was editor of the Sunday New York Times. So that was my management background. But I think that the experience that maybe matters the most for me is this time I spent reporting on the grassroots, seeing the consequences firsthand when programs don't work out, and understanding the consequences when the pie grows, but we divide it in ways that are profoundly unfair. When I was studying economics, when I took Ec 10, we had the impression that the winners could compensate the losers, and that if somebody lost their job, then they lost an income stream. And I think that we didn't fully appreciate that a job is about so much more than an income stream. It's about identity. It's about a sense of purpose. It's about your place in society. It's about your dignity. And when my classmates lost those jobs and that sense of the table and that identity, then they were much more likely to behave in self-destructive ways. And ultimately, what ripped was the entire social fabric. And for anybody who thought that we were going to save money by spending less on contracts, by bringing in non-union companies, that completely misunderstands what followed, what succeeded in places like Yamhill. When our glove factory moved away, we got cheaper gloves, but the cost to society here was enormous. And look, I'm not a Luddite. There has to be a period of economic progress, and jobs are going to be displaced. But we have to do a much, much better job of focusing on job training, on support, on children, on education. And I don't think we do that. And I think that lived experience that has profoundly shaped me, that's why I am running for governor. I've just seen too many people struggling. I've been to too many funerals, and I think we can do better.
And I think that also in a governor's role, your experience at the governing boards of both Harvard University and the Rhodes Scholars has also given you quite a very powerful, oversight experience that could be very helpful to a governor's role. Well, thank you very much. And I want to thank everybody for their very wonderful questions. And I'm sorry if we couldn't get to all of them. They were all very, very good questions, and we appreciate them. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for having us. It was great to be with you.